Stalag 13 was not the best place in the world to spend World War II, but there could be much worse places to have to be. Hogan and his men enjoyed some privacy and had times that they enjoyed when the Germans got into trouble because of them. Klink was one of their reasons for having it so easy. He was a blundering idiot and wouldn't know an escape tunnel if it came up and bit him. But he was some of the reason why Colonel Hogan and his men had been so successful with their espionage. As a rule, Colonel Klink did not go into town very often. He was usually found at his office or at his small hut where he slept. Hogan and his men were sure alone most of the time. But there was something going on with Colonel Klink. Hogan and his men watched with great surprise as Colonel Klink left for town for the third time that week. He was all dressed up and jumping around like a teenager. Something told Hogan that he was going into town to meet a girl. Hogan needed to talk to Sergeant Schultz. Whenever there was something going on around camp, Schultz was the man to ask. His favorite phrase was, "I see nothing," but then he would brag about what he knew. That evening it was Colonel Hogan's luck when he spotted Schultz headed toward his barracks. LeBeau and Newkirk had the chocolate ready to offer Schultz, and as the large man entered the barracks he was met by most of Colonel Hogan's men. They were all curious as to what Colonel Klink was up to. Hogan knew how to get him to talk and told his men, "Settle down, Schultz knows nothing about what is going on." Sergeant Schultz looked at Colonel Hogan and his men and said, "Maybe I do know, maybe I don't know," and with that he eyed the chocolate that Newkirk was holding. Newkirk smiled at Schultz and said, This is good chocolate, Schultz. Can't you tell us what is going on with Colonel Klink? We couldn't help but notice that this was the third night that he has gone into town this week," and with that he waved the chocolate under Schultz's nose. It was no use and Schultz knew it. He was going to end up telling Hogan and his men anyways. It seemed that every time he came to the barracks they got something out of him for information. As he took the candy he took a seat at the table. "I have not seen the lady that the colonel has been seeing. But I have been told that she is a very nice-looking woman. They have been meeting at a local hotel downtown. Colonel Klink was bragging about it this afternoon. Boy, that man put enough cologne on to kill a skunk's smell," Schultz told them. Colonel Hogan was the first man to speak up. "Come on, Schultz, you can do better than that. We all know that as far as finding pretty women goes, Klink has always scored a zero," and with that Ellie laughed. "But it's true. He has been seeing a woman every day this week almost. I don't know her name yet, but she is supposed to have a lot of money," Schultz told the men. Colonel Hogan was thinking hard, so it was true that Klink had a lady friend. This would be something that could keep the colonel's mind off of the Stalag possibly and make life a little easier for him and his little group. But who was she, he wondered. That evening Hogan and his men observed Klink coming home very late. He was obviously in good spirits and Hogan made up his mind to talk to him about his new woman in the morning. Roll call was held at the same time every morning. When the roll call was through, Hogan walked up to Colonel Klink and said, "Colonel, I need to talk to you." Hogan was expecting some kind of stupid remark from the colonel, but instead Klink welcomed him into the office. When Klink offered him a cigar, Hogan was truly surprised. "What can I do for you on this bright and warm morning, Hogan?" he asked. Hogan sat back in the chair and took a long drag off of the cigar and said, "Quite honestly, my men and I have noticed that you have been leaving camp every night and going into town. Do you have a lady friend by any chance?" he asked him with a smile. Klink was indeed proud of himself. He did have a woman, a lovely woman at that. He smiled and said, "What is it to you? We were just wondering. We never hear anything very new and interesting around the camp." "This is big news to us, sir," Hogan told him. "I was at one of the local hotels and I met this woman. She is very smart and beautiful and she likes me. We have been together 3 out of the last 5 nights. She lives somewhere in town." Klink bragged to Hogan. "Is she rich? Are you sure that she is not married?" Hogan asked. Klink smiled and said she was married, but her husband has been reported missing at the Russian front. She has not seen or heard from the man in over 6 months, he offered. Then he could still return to town. "Be careful, Colonel. If he finds out that his wife and you have been seeing each other, he might not be very happy," Colonel Hogan warned him. "Don't be silly, Colonel Hogan. The man is a colonel himself at the Russian front and there is no hope that he will ever get back here. People disappear there all the time. Besides, she says that she is very fond of me. I hope that everything works out all right, Klink," Colonel Hogan told him. But as Hogan began the walk across the compound, he saw a car pulling up and a strange colonel getting out of the car. Hogan hurried to the barracks and plugged in the coffee pot. Trouble was stirring. It was the lady's husband that had just come into Klink's office. Chapter 2. The men in Colonel Hogan's barracks were all smiling as they listened in on the conversation in Klink's office. The tone was not a friendly one, and Colonel Klink was so busy backstepping that he might have backstepped himself right into World War I. Colonel Klink had been in his office singing to himself. He was looking in the mirror and smiling at himself. He was not that bad a looking man, and his new woman had given him some spice to his life. She was not particularly beautiful, but she was very nice and she was very interested in him. He knew that most of the eligible men in the area were away with the war. That made him a prime candidate for the women who lived in town. Sadly, even with this advantage, he still had little or no luck with the women. When Klink had heard the car pull up front, he had paid little attention to it. He was expecting some shipments to arrive that day and had assumed that was what had just come into the compound. If he had been smart, he would have looked out the door and hid. The man who entered his office was a grumpy man who was in no mood for talking or reason. Colonel Klink had turned around when he heard his office door. He saw the man that he did not want to see. The man was a man who he had met a few times, and he was the missing husband of the woman he had been seeing. Albert Wagner was a tall, demanding man, and he was there to let Colonel Klink know that he was in way over his head. "I am here because the word in town is that you have been seeing my wife," he demanded. The men in the barracks were dying to hear what the colonel was going to say about this. They knew that Klink was a wimpy coward and that he was not good at confrontations at all. They wished that they had a camera set up in the office too. They would have given up their chocolates for the month to have seen Klink as he tried to explain himself to the man. But Colonel Klink had a little more stamina than the men and the other colonel thought he had. He stood up to the man and said, "Your wife and I have done nothing that was disrespectful. We have gone to a hotel in town, yes, but we have never done anything but spend some time together and share a few drinks," he nearly whined. Colonel Wagner looked at the pathetic man who his wife had been seeing and laughed. "I don't doubt that one bit. Why, my wife would have no more interest in you than she would in a stray dog. You are nothing but a pitiful man. But I know just what is good for you. Something that will bring the color to your cheeks." Colonel Klink did not want to know the answer to this question, but he had to ask. "Can I ask what you are talking about?" he said. The colonel gave Klink a smile. No, it wasn't a smile, it was more of a sneer. "I think that the best place for you would be to send you to the Russian front. There you would learn that it is not in good taste to be seen with someone else's wife," he yelled at Klink. This was the last thing that Klink needed to hear. He was going to be 50 soon, and the Russian front was cold and deadly. You barely ever heard of anyone coming back from there. The only men that came home from the Russian front came home in a pine box, and they were the lucky ones. "Colonel Wagner, I am a well-respected member of this community and have a perfect record here at Stalag 13. I am needed here much more than I am needed at the Russian front. I don't think that you have the ability to send me there either," Klink told him with a snarl of his own. Colonel Wagner laughed at the man who was standing in front of him. He really was an awful man. He was a coward who did belong here at a Stalag. That was all he was good for. But he had been seen with his wife Alicia, and he was going to avenge him for that. "I will be back, my friend, and when I get back you had better plan on packing your snowshoes," and with that he walked out the door, allowing the door to slam hard as he left. Colonel Klink took a deep breath and watched through the side of the curtain as the other colonel left the office. Colonel Hogan and his men had listened to the confrontation of the two German colonels and laughed to himself. "Well, now he won't be leaving every night, and for the next few days he is going to be impossible," he thought to himself. The rest of the men were laughing as they pictured Colonel Klink in his office with this other colonel. The colonel had warned Klink of things to come though, and Hogan had to take it seriously. "Kinch, I want you to get a hold of London and have them find out all they can about Colonel Albert Wagner. If he is going to cause us some trouble, I want to be ready for him," Hogan told him. Just then Schultz came into the barracks thinking he had some great news for the men. When the colonel told him what they knew, he was very disappointed. Schultz had been hoping that he could get a candy bar from Hogan's men. "We know all about it. Colonel Wagner has now threatened Klink with the Russian front. He will be impossible. Remember the last time the colonel was threatened with the Russian front?" Colonel Hogan asked. Oh, indeed, Schultz remembered that day well. Colonel Klink had told him that if he was going to the Russian front, Schultz was going with him. He had packed his bags when somehow or another the orders had been cancelled. Colonel Hogan had just ruined his day, and he hung his head as he walked out the barracks door. Chapter 3. For all the joy that the thought of Klink at Russian front brought, Colonel Hogan knew that this could mean problems for him and his crew. Colonel Klink had been very instrumental in the success of his espionage. Without the help of Klink and Schultz, he was sure that their success would be gravely compromised. He was going to have to make sure that nothing happened to either man. In the meantime, Colonel Klink was upset himself. He had stood up to that terrible colonel and for once had not backed down like the yellow-bellied man that he usually was. But he was sick and tired of always being accused of things that he had not done. It was indeed true that he had been seen with the lady at a local hotel. But they had never done anything but talk and dance. They had never done anything that was disrespectful of the marriage between Albert and Alicia. Sergeant Schultz was not having the best of days himself. One of his biggest fears was that he would end up on the Russian front. He was an old man and very large. The Russians would have an easy target in him. He needed to get Hogan to help him stay at Stalag 13. The prisoner of war camp was as close to hell as he wanted to be. If he had to be in this war, he wanted to spend his time in the safety of the camp, not in the ice-cold weather that the Russian front had to offer. So it was with the knowledge of what could happen to Colonel Hogan and his men that Colonel Hogan wanted to find out all that he could about Colonel Albert Wagner and his wife Alicia. The woman had been seen around town and had been hard enough off to be seen with Klink. Now he wanted to know why and who these people were. He was now on a mission and was going to make sure that Colonel Klink remained the commanding officer of the Stalag. The first thing that Colonel Hogan needed to do was make plans for the next mission that they were going to be going on. The mission was an important one as the word had reached him that there soon was going to be a new depot in town where they were going to be storing fuel. This was something that the Germans needed for use in many of the factories in the area. One of the problems for the Germans was that by the time the trucks that were on conveys arrived near the town, they were low on fuel. This was a good stopping point for the conveys, and Hogan did not want their job to be easy. In just a few weeks it had been planned that Hogan and his men were going to where the depot was almost finished and burn the place down. There would be a lot of fuel there ready for the convey that was due to arrive in the morning. At night this was the best time to do any damage without being caught. The other good thing was that the man in charge of the depot was now none other than Colonel Albert Wagner. He was going to be taking over the job as of tomorrow. Colonel Hogan and his men were going to give him a big welcoming party. Hogan had great hopes that he could get rid of two problems at once. But it was important that they wait until the Germans had finished the compound. First, the fuel would be there in full, and second, the Germans would have expended more money. This was going to need to be carefully planned, as the men of Stalag 13 were working with Colonel Hogan to make sure that this mission was as successful as all of the other missions that they had been on. Carter was the bombing expert and he was proud of his work. He had been down in the tunnel working most of the day on perfecting the bomb and carefully going over the pictures that had been taken of the compound a few days before. There would be a total of 5 separate bombs placed in strategic spots inside of the compound. Each bomb would have a 20-minute delay. As Colonel Hogan went down the steps to the hidden tunnel, he smiled at Carter. The bombs were almost ready and each of the men were told what their role was going to be for this particular mission. Each and every moment of the mission was gone over several times, and on the night that had been decided, Hogan and his men once more left the Stalag and headed out to the compound. The weather was cold and there was snow on the ground. The men slipped as they went down the hill towards the large compound. There were several guards and each one of them had a dog. The men would have to be very quiet and careful. As Colonel Hogan and his men approached the compound, they watched their watches very carefully. With the skill of men who had done this before, the first bomb was placed near some of the stored fuel. They laid back and waited for the dog and the German to go by and headed to the next location. The men needed to hurry because there was but a 20-minute delay. With each bomb placed, Hogan knew that the mission had indeed been a success. Hogan and his men then began the trek back to the Stalag. They needed to get away from the compound quickly because according to Hogan's watch they had but 3 minutes before the first bomb went off. As the men climbed the hill back to Stalag 13, there was a loud explosion. The fire that ensued afterwards was bright and lit up the entire sky. It was then that Hogan and the men realized that they could now be seen. With haste the men hurried back to the Stalag 13. They could hear the other explosions as they hurried into the tree trunk in safety. They could hear the dogs as they closed in on Hogan and his men. Colonel Hogan and his men breathed a sigh of relief as they came into the tunnel. This had been a close one and they had nearly gotten caught. As the men climbed the ladder back to the barracks, there was the loud shrill of the warning signal. All of the prisoners were required to come outside for a midnight roll call. Carter and the men still had some black on their faces and had to clean themselves quickly. As the other men kept stalling to give Hogan and his men the time they needed, each man got outside. Colonel Klink was now standing outside of his office. Colonel Wagner was standing next to him. He was demanding to see all of the men and verify that they were indeed at the compound. Klink showed him proudly that all of his prisoners were there, and Colonel Wagner left with a huff. He had to find those men who had just destroyed his fuel compound. If he didn't, he knew that he would be back on his way to the Russian front again. Colonel Hogan and his men watched as Colonel Wagner and his men left the compound without any proof that anything had happened once again. It was just a simple little victory for the men, but it was a victory for sure. They could see the flames of the depot easily from the barracks. The fuel depot burned for days. Colonel Wagner had been writing down all of the things that had happened to the Germans in the last year. To his amazement, over and over there had been some form of espionage done, and right smack in the middle of the espionage was Stalag 13. He was sure that Colonel Klink had something to do with the problem, and he was going to prove it. No one could be as stupid as Colonel Klink was. It was just an act, Colonel Wagner was sure. Somehow Colonel Klink and the prisoners were working hand in hand in their many acts of espionage, and he was going to prove it one way or another. Each and every night Colonel Wagner had extra patrols placed outside of the prison camp. If someone left the compound, the car was followed time and time again. But still he had no evidence. But Newkirk and LeBeau had been out on a routine job when they had escaped by the skin of their teeth. Colonel Hogan was surprised to find his men back so quickly. Newkirk said, "It is no good, sir. There were so many German soldiers and dogs out there in the woods that LeBeau and I just barely got back inside. Until things settle down, we aren't going to be able to get out of the camp at all." This was not good for Hogan and his men. They had several things to do, and he could not put up with this kind of interference. Colonel Hogan looked at his men and shook his head. "This has got to be stopped. We have a war to win." Colonel Klink had not left Stalag 13 ever since Colonel Wagner had come into town. He was genuinely worried about what lay ahead for him. He knew that Colonel Wagner was a man on a mission. He had been told by some of his guards that Wagner had placed several guards outside of the POW camp and that he was being watched very earnestly. The last thing that Klink wanted right now was a visit from Colonel Hogan. But when he heard his secretaries giggle, he knew that Hogan was now in his outer office. He opened the door and said, "Hogan, please come in." With that, Hogan had put his arms down and pinched the German girl on the cheek. He headed into Klink's office with a Cheshire cat grin on his face. As he took some cigars out of the German officer's cigar box, Colonel Hogan took a seat. "How can I help you today, Hogan?" Klink demanded. Colonel Hogan was far from worried about what this German officer thought about him. So he said, "I was just wondering how you and the colonel's wife were doing. I haven't seen you leave the compound lately," he told him. "Colonel Hogan, I don't think that my personal life should be any of your business." Colonel Klink countered. "When it affects the moral of my men and the men here at Stalag 13, it is my business. We have heard word that there are so many guards outside of the camp that it is near to impossible for a German to leave the Stalag, never mind the prisoners. What is it with all these extra patrols?" Colonel Hogan asked Klink. "I am aware of the increase in guards. I can hear the dogs outside at all hours of the night. Colonel Wagner is trying to prove that there is some sort of espionage ring right here in this area. It is the silliest thing that I have ever heard. But he is determined to prove that he is right. He knows that he is going to be the next German officer to go out to the Russian front again if he doesn't find out who blew up the fuel depot last week." Colonel Klink told Hogan. Colonel Hogan needed to get hold of a Russian lady that he had worked with many times before. She was not someone that he trusted entirely, but she was a Russian, and with the help of some of her friends things could be planted in some of the German minds that Wagner had become friendly with the Russians when he was stationed at the Russian front. Right now the Germans were having so much trouble at the Russian front, they believed just about anything with just a push, and sometimes it ended in death for the German soldier. Finally, after several minutes in the office, Klink announced that he was going into town that night. He didn't care what Wagner said. This was going to be Colonel Hogan's chance to get into town. He would ride in the trunk. As Colonel Klink placed the call for his personal car, Hogan had his men drive the car to the office. Both Newkirk and Carter would be driving Colonel Klink that night, and Hogan would hide in the trunk. Colonel Klink would have no idea that they were with him. He wanted to go back to the same hotel where he had met Wagner's wife, and Hogan and his men were happy to accommodate him. As Colonel Klink was left at the hotel, Newkirk noticed the car that was following them. So they had to wait. Colonel Hogan lay quiet in the trunk, and Carter and Newkirk stood outside of the car waiting for the other car to leave. Once the car left, Hogan was surprised to see Maria already there watching them. She had seen the car that had been following the fool named Klink and thought that Hogan and his men were somehow involved. As she had watched Colonel Hogan climb out of the trunk, she knew that she was right. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Maria was good at her job. Hogan had never been sure what side she was really on. But she knew many things about his operation and he needed her help now. She had other Russian contacts and it was time for him to make sure that Colonel Wagner no longer posed a threat to Klink or his operation. Maria had a car just around the corner and told Hogan that her car was the best place for them to talk. As Hogan got into the car, he found Maria pulling out a bottle of wine. She handed a glass to Hogan and with her deep Russian accent said, "So what brings you into town, Colonel?" And then she looked at his intently. Colonel Hogan took a sip of the wine and then turned to Maria. "I have a problem with a certain colonel. Colonel Wagner. I have heard of his wishes. He wants to put your Colonel Klink at the Russian front." Klink was seeing his wife and he didn't appreciate that. "Oh, but why? Klink is nothing." His wife only was trying to get another officer jealous. She wasn't interested in Klink. She has been seen with many different officers since her husband has been at the Russian front. She looked at her glass of wine and smiled. "I am going to need something to be planted in the Germans' minds that will make them think that Colonel Wagner is now friendly with the Russians. I want him to look as though he was a spy for the Russians if possible." Colonel Hogan told her. Maria thought for a moment. "What you are asking could be very dangerous and difficult. What do I get in return for the work you wish me to do?" she asked him. Colonel Hogan knew that Maria would want some sort of payment and he hated to ask, "But what would you wish for doing this job?" Hogan asked her. Maria thought for a moment and said, "I want a real date with you, Colonel. I want a candlelight dinner with all of the fixings," she told him. Colonel Hogan thought that his was a reasonable request. Although he was not very fond of the lady, one dinner was not that much to ask. "All right, I will agree to that," Hogan told her with a smile. This was when Maria wasn't positive that she could trust Hogan to do what he said. But she had dealt with him before and knew that he heeded this done. She also knew that if Klink was brought to the Russian front, things would change drastically for her also. With Klink here, she had little to worry about with her different operations. If the Germans got a competent colonel, her little spy ring and Colonel Hogan's could be finished. "All right, give me a couple of days and then keep your ears on at Colonel Klink's office. I will have a surprise for you, I promise," Maria told him. But just then Newkirk waved to Hogan. Klink was leaving the hotel, and so as Klink got into the car, Hogan once again slipped into the trunk. As the car drove down the road toward Stalag 13, Colonel Hogan hoped that things were going to work out. He thought of the dinner that he was going to have with Maria. He would have Lebeau make one of his specialties and they would enjoy the meal in his private room, he thought to himself. Colonel Wagner had been outside of Stalag 13 for 2 weeks now and was getting nowhere. His men had found no one in the woods but locals who were walking their dogs and such. Most of the people had been old men and women, and he was sure had nothing to do with the espionage ring that he was sure was running here in this town. The fuel depot had been destroyed and months of work had been thrown away the night of the destruction. The men had seen a group of 4 men as they had run up the hill in the direction of Colonel Klink's prisoner of war camp, and he was sure there was something going on there no matter what people said. He was sure that Klink was a spy for the enemy and he was going to prove it. Maria had gone to work on helping out Colonel Hogan as soon as he had left that night. She had several operatives in the area and went about contacting them. The first woman that she had was a beautiful lady, and word was going to be spread around town that she was getting very friendly with Colonel Wagner. She enjoyed getting German officers in trouble and she was going to have fun with this Wagner guy. Colonel Wagner was at a stop sign in town talking to some soldiers when a lady came up to him. She made her best attempt at acting as though they were the best of friends. As a matter of fact, she threw herself at him. She used her sexuality to grab all of the men's attention and kissed him on the lips right there in the middle of town. He pushed her off. But she said, "Oh, you just don't anyone to know about us," and put on what he called the puppy dog eyes. With that he had left the area mad at her and embarrassed that his men had seen such a show. But the Russian operative wasn't done with Colonel Wagner. It was time for her so-called husband to show up at a local restaurant where the colonel and his wife were dining. He confronted the colonel and very loudly shouted at him, "You are seeing my wife? Oh, don't try to deny it. You were seen on the corner kissing and acting very familiar with her this afternoon." Colonel Wagner turned to the man who was shouting at him and said, "Sir, I assure you I know nothing about what you are talking about." He knew that this was a setup, but his wife was there and so wasn't a restaurant full of people. Without warning, the man punched Colonel Wagner. He then held a gun on the colonel as he backed out of the restaurant. Colonel Wagner just sat there trying to explain to his wife what had happened. But she wasn't listening to him and walked out the door. Chapter 6. Colonel Wagner was now in a jam. This Russian lady had made a scene in front of him on a busy street corner, and now a man has accosted him at a restaurant and in front of 50 other guests, and he was sure that word was going to get out to his superiors. This, on top of everything that had happened at the fuel depot, was too much to be a coincidence. At this point all Wagner could do was to go home and talk to his wife. He had to explain that someone was out to get him. But when he arrived at home things did not go well. She was in no mood to listen and went to bed and slammed the door. In the meantime word had reached the area, and Colonel Wagner's superior General Schmidt had enough. He was sick and tired of the whining colonel who insisted that Colonel Klink was the head of some sort of espionage ring. He had met the blubbering idiot many times and he was barely capable of tying his own boots. He couldn't head a babysitting club. It was some kind of miracle that he could run a stalag. The fuel depot had been a definite case of espionage and Colonel Wagner had been in charge of its operation. General Schmidt had received enough grief from Berlin about the depot. He had looked into the bombing, but so far had no luck. As he listened to Colonel Wagner rant and rave over the phone once again about Colonel Klink and his band of prisoners that ran the espionage ring, Ed decided to take him serious and send his own investigator out. He sent a colonel by the name of Brum. He was known for his thoroughness and he would go and look into Colonel Klink. Colonel Hogan and his men were outside in the compound when they saw the colonel car pull up. They went inside immediately and surrounded the coffee pot so that they could listen to what was going on in Klink's office. This was trouble, big trouble. The men had only a few minutes to rid the barracks of everything and place the things down in the tunnel. The tunnel's entrance was to be covered entirely and they would have to sweat this one out. Colonel Hogan told the men what to do and they began the complete process of cleaning out any hint that the barracks was anything more than a POW barracks and placed it down in the tunnel. They then closed off the entrance to the tunnel. It was set up so that a simple banging on the side of one of the bunks could open the door, and that had to be closed off. But Hogan needed to buy them some time, so he went over to Klink's office. He was good at stalling and watched as one of his men went to the standby barracks to instruct the men there on what to do. The barracks next door had a tunnel entrance also, and that had to be contained. As Hogan approached the office of Colonel Klink, he smiled to himself. He would and could keep the colonel and the general busy for 20 or so minutes. As he entered the office he said, "Oh, I am sorry Colonel Klink, I didn't know you had company." Colonel Klink was very frustrated. This man was here accusing him of running a spy ring of some sort out of his office. Silly to think that. "What do you say, Hogan?" the general asked. Colonel Hogan was doing his best to put on his straightest face as he reached into the cigar box once more to help himself to a couple of cigars. "I don't know, General. Klink is a pretty tough German to deal with. It seems to me if he was a spy of some sort there would be more prisoners escaping. We haven't been able to get one prisoner out of here ever since he came here to be commandant," he told him in a fake worried tone. The general was not impressed and told his sergeant that had been standing in the corner the whole time. "It is time for me to investigate each and every barracks here on the compound and make sure that they are nothing but POW barracks," he told them. Colonel Hogan looked to Colonel Klink and protested, but there was nothing neither one of them could do. The general and his men were on their way to the barracks and Colonel Hogan prayed that his men had the time to get rid of everything. As Colonel Hogan followed the Germans to his barracks he was glad to see them all sitting there playing cards when the Germans came in. Each and every inch of the barracks was checked and when they found nothing they moved directly to the next barracks. The rest of the day was spent watching the Germans as they checked each and every foot of the compound. But at the end of the day they had found nothing. Colonel Klink had shrugged his shoulders and smiled. "I told you that there was nothing going on here. Colonel Wagner is just angry because I was seeing his wife. But I have heard that he too has been seeing another woman. She is a Russian lady and maybe you ought to look into that. I think that he is the spy, not me." General Schmidt had thought about that concept when he had heard of the Russian lady in town. He knew that some Russians were on the German side but knew that many were not. He didn't trust a Russian at all. As Hogan and his men watched General Schmidt and his men leave they all breathed a sigh of relief. But what was Maria up to? She was supposed to help out with getting rid of Wagner and now they had a visit that could have destroyed their little setup. But Maria was busy herself. She had set up the man and the woman and had embarrassed Wagner. Now it was time for her to convince the Germans even more that Wagner was a spy for the enemy. She knew that the Germans were getting suspicious and decided to plant something at his house. In his desk, while the colonel had been at dinner, she had planted a letter. The letter was written to him declaring her love for him. She talked to him about their meetings while in Russia and the love that the two of them had for each other. She knew that Wagner was proficient in Russian, so the letter was written in Russian. That night, as Wagner and his wife sat in the living room when General Schmidt and his men came to the door, they went through everything, and there on the desk they found the love letter. His life as a colonel was over and he knew it. He was taken to Gestapo headquarters and questioned. The letter was translated, and this time there was no hope for him. Before he could be forced back to the front lines, he took his life. Hogan and his men were safe once more.